I've always been a private person. It's not that I'm antisocial. I wave to my neighbors, attend the occasional community barbecue, and dutifully drag my trash cans to the curb on the designated days. But my home is my sanctuary, my refuge from the chaos of the outside world. So when I purchased my house in Willow Creek Estates last year, I was prepared for the standard HOA regulations: lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and the like. What I wasn't prepared for was Margaret Thornton, known not so affectionately throughout the neighborhood as Karen, and her personal crusade to inspect every inch of every property under her jurisdiction. Margaret had been the president of the Homeowners Association for 7 consecutive years, a tenure marked by ever-increasing restrictions and an enforcement style that bordered on militant. She was in her mid-50s, with a meticulously maintained blonde bob that seemed impervious to humidity and wind. Her wardrobe consisted exclusively of pastel pantsuits and pearl necklaces, which she would clutch dramatically when describing perceived violations of the community standards she held so dear. My first encounter with Margaret came just 3 weeks after I moved in. I was unpacking in my home office when an aggressive knocking interrupted my thoughts. I opened my front door to find Margaret standing on my porch, clipboard in hand, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone of forced politeness that immediately puts one on edge. "I'm Margaret Thornton, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I'm conducting the quarterly home inspections today." I smiled politely, still naively believing this would be a brief, professional interaction. "Nice to meet you. I'm just getting settled in, but everything should be in order. The previous owners left the place in great condition." Margaret didn't seem convinced. "Yes, well, that remains to be seen," she replied, consulting her clipboard with an air of great importance. "We'll need to check both the exterior and interior of the property to ensure compliance with all HOA regulations." I blinked, certain I had misheard her. "I'm sorry, did you say interior?" "Of course," she nodded briskly. "Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA covenant clearly states that the association reserves the right to inspect all aspects of member properties to ensure community standards are maintained." She began to step forward as if the matter were settled. I remained firmly in my doorway, blocking her entry. "I'd like to see that specific regulation, please. I've reviewed the covenant carefully and I don't recall any provisions for interior home inspections." Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't have the specific page with me, but I assure you it's standard procedure. We need to check for unapproved modifications, water damage that could affect adjoining properties, proper window coverings visible from the street." She trailed off, clearly expecting me to step aside. Instead, I held my ground. "I'm not comfortable with an interior inspection without prior written notice and documentation of this requirement. I'd be happy to review any exterior concerns you might have about the property." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been conducting these inspections for 7 years. No one else has ever objected. Are you suggesting you have something to hide?" "Not at all," I replied calmly. "I'm simply exercising my right to privacy within my own home. I'll gladly address any specific exterior concerns and review the regulation you mentioned if it does exist. We can schedule a mutually convenient time for an inspection with proper notice." Margaret's pleasant facade began to crack. "This is most irregular. Delays in inspection could result in fines if violations are later discussed." "I understand the concern," I said, "but I'll need to see the specific regulation before allowing an interior inspection. I hope you understand." With visible reluctance, Margaret completed her exterior inspection, making several notes on her clipboard. My grass was a quarter-inch too tall, apparently, and my garbage cans were visible from the street if one stood at a particular angle and squinted. She left with a promise to provide the interior inspection regulation and a thinly veiled warning about starting off on the wrong foot with the HOA. That evening, I combed through the 100-plus pages of the HOA covenant. As I suspected, there was no provision for interior home inspections. The document clearly limited the association's authority to exterior elements visible from common areas or affecting adjoining properties. Armed with this knowledge, I felt prepared for Margaret's inevitable return. Little did I know, the situation was about to escalate far beyond what I could have imagined. I didn't have to wait long for Margaret's return. 3 days later, another sharp knock announced her presence on my porch. This time, she had brought reinforcements in the form of Walter Jenkins, the HOA vice president, a retired accountant who followed Margaret around like an anxious shadow, rarely speaking but constantly nodding in agreement with whatever she said. Walter was a slight man, perpetually in a state of discomfort, and today was no exception. He shifted nervously from foot to foot as Margaret began her usual spiel. "Mr. Mitchell," Margaret began without preamble, "I've brought the relevant section of the covenant regarding inspections." She handed me a single photocopied page with one paragraph highlighted in bright yellow. I took the paper, carefully reading it. The highlighted section stated that the HOA had the right to inspect all exterior elements of the property for compliance with community standards. But my eyes caught something strange. Someone had added the word interior in ballpoint pen, wedged clumsily between the words all and exterior. I looked up from the paper. "Margaret, this document has been altered. The word interior has been added by hand, and it doesn't appear in the original covenant." Margaret's face flushed slightly, but she recovered quickly, trying to maintain her usual icy composure. "That was simply a clarification added during our last board meeting," she said, her voice tight. "The intention has always been to include interior elements that could affect property values." "Intentions and written regulations are different things," I replied firmly. "Unless the covenant is formally amended through the proper channels, with a 2/3 vote of all homeowners, as required in Section 3, the current regulation stands. And they do not authorize interior inspections." Walter, who had been silently observing, suddenly found his voice. "Young man, Margaret has been running this HOA since before you even thought about moving here," he said, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "Her dedication has kept our property values the highest in the county. A little cooperation wouldn't kill you." I turned to Walter, holding my ground. "I'm happy to cooperate with all legitimate HOA requirements, but I will not allow unauthorized entry into my home based on regulations that don't exist or have been improperly modified." Margaret's expression hardened. "Very well," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "The board will be discussing your case at our next meeting. Expect a formal notice of noncompliance." With that, she turned on her heel, marching down my walkway, Walter scurrying to keep up with her determined stride. I watched them leave, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. I knew this wasn't over, but I wasn't going to back down either. True to her word, a notice of noncompliance arrived in my mailbox the following week. The letter cited my refusal to permit the required inspections and threatened a $50 daily fine until the inspection was completed. It was clear that Margaret wasn't going to let go of this so easily. Having anticipated this, I consulted with an attorney friend who specialized in property law. He confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA had no legal grounds for interior inspections without specific covenant provisions or evidence of violations affecting neighboring properties. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted a response, citing the relevant sections of the covenant, state law regarding property rights, and a polite but firm refusal to pay any fines based on fabricated violations. I sent copies of the letter to each board member individually rather than just Margaret, ensuring that everyone was aware of the situation. The fines were quietly dropped, but my victory was short-lived. What followed was a campaign of petty harassment disguised as HOA enforcement. I began receiving notices for infractions as minor as excessive birdseed in my feeder, unapproved vegetation, wildflowers planted by the previous owner, which had been approved years ago, and improper mailbox height. In one instance, a third-party measurement confirmed that my mailbox was exactly at the required 41 inches, but the notice still demanded I correct it. Each notice required a formal response, documentation, and sometimes even in-person appearances at board meetings. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, all orchestrated by Margaret from her position of authority. But I wasn't about to let her wear me down. I meticulously documented everything, building a case of targeted harassment that I hoped would never need to be used, but I kept it ready just in case. One Saturday morning in April, I was enjoying a rare day off, sipping coffee on my back patio and reading when I heard the sound of a gate latch. Peering around the corner of my house, I was stunned to see Margaret and Walter entering my backyard through the side gate, clipboards and hands raised, ready to mark down violations. I stood up, my calm demeanor masking the irritation bubbling inside me. "Excuse me," I called out, setting down my book and coffee. "What are you doing on my property?" Margaret looked up, seemingly unsurprised to find me home. "Quarterly exterior inspection," she replied with that same artificial pleasantness. "We've had reports of unapproved landscaping modifications in the back garden areas." I walked toward them, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Any exterior inspections need to be scheduled in advance, as per Section 8 of the covenant, and they certainly don't authorize entering private property through closed gates without permission." "We sent a notification email last week," Walter offered, though his shaky voice suggested he wasn't entirely sure of what he was saying. "I received no such email," I replied. "And even if you had, electronic notification isn't sufficient for property entry. According to our covenant, you need written notice delivered to the property at least 72 hours in advance. I'm going to have to ask you both to leave my property immediately." Margaret's pleasant mask slipped entirely. "This is ridiculous. We are conducting official HOA business. Your continued obstruction is going to result in significant fines." "You're trespassing on private property," I countered. "Please leave now, or I'll be forced to call the authorities." "Call them," Margaret snapped, her face flushing with anger. "I'd love to explain to them how you're violating legally binding covenants and interfering with official community business." I pulled out my phone. "That's your right. But from where I'm standing, the only violation occurring is your unauthorized presence on my property. You have one more chance. Are you leaving voluntarily, or should I make the call?" Margaret crossed her arms defiantly. "Make it," she hissed. Walter, looking considerably less confident, remained silent, his eyes darting nervously between Margaret and me. I dialed the non-emergency police number and briefly explained the situation, requesting an officer to document a trespassing incident. Throughout the call, I maintained a calm, reasonable tone, while Margaret stood in silence, fuming. I hung up the phone. "They'll be here shortly," I informed them. "You're welcome to wait on the public sidewalk." Margaret remained rooted to the spot. "We're staying right here." "Well, I'm afraid that's trespassing," I said, my voice calm. "The officers can sort out what happens next." What happened next left me momentarily speechless. Margaret, looking increasingly desperate, pulled out her own phone, dialed, and after a brief pause announced, "Yes, this is an emergency. I need immediate police assistance." She proceeded to tell the 911 dispatcher that she was being threatened and held against her will while performing her official duties, that I was becoming aggressive, and that she feared for her safety. I stood there in disbelief, listening to her fabricate a dangerous situation out of thin air. Walter took a few steps back, clearly uncomfortable with Margaret's actions, but remained at her side. When Margaret ended the call, I shook my head slowly. "Margaret, you just filed a false police report. That's a criminal offense. There are no threats here, and you're free to leave at any time. In fact, I've repeatedly asked you to do so." "We'll see who the police believe," Margaret retorted with a smug certainty that suggested this tactic had worked for her in the past. Thanks to Margaret's 911 call, we didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of my house, lights flashing but sirens silent, a response that seemed comically excessive for the situation, but appropriate given the dangerous scenario Margaret had described. 4 officers approached cautiously through the still open side gate, their wary eyes taking in the scene. 3 middle-aged people standing in a backyard. "What's going on here?" asked the lead officer, a sergeant with the name tag Ramirez, in a weary expression. Margaret immediately launched into her version of events, describing how she was just performing her duties when I became confrontational and threatening, supposedly blocking her exit and creating a hostile environment. Her dramatic recounting was full of exaggerated gestures and a voice full of faux concern. I stood there silently, waiting for my turn. When she finished, Sergeant Ramirez turned to me. "Your side of the story, sir?" "I was in my backyard when these individuals entered through my gate without permission or prior notice," I explained calmly. "When I asked them to leave my private property, they refused. I called a non-emergency line to report trespassing, and then Miss Thornton called 911 with what I believed to be a false report of threats and being held against her will." I gestured to the open gate. "As you can see, no one is being prevented from leaving. and there have been no threats of any kind. Sergeant Ramirez nodded thoughtfully, then looked at Walter. And you, sir? Walter, clearly wanting no part of this mess, glanced between Margaret and the officers, a nervous look in his eyes. Well, that is... He's right. There weren't any threats. Margaret, um, might have overreacted a bit. Margaret gasped in disbelief. Walter, that is not what happened at all. Tell them about how hostile he's been, how he's blocked all our inspections. The officers exchanged knowing glances, clearly accustomed to neighborhood disputes but taken aback by the gravity of the false report. Sergeant Ramirez addressed Margaret with a stern expression. Ma'am, let me make sure I understand the situation correctly. You entered this private property without the owner's permission or a court order, refused to leave when asked, and then called 911 claiming an emergency situation that doesn't appear to exist. Is that accurate? Margaret's face turned a shade paler as she sputtered. That's not... you're twisting my words. Sergeant Ramirez turned to me. Do you have documentation of the HOA regulations? I retrieved my copy of the original, unaltered covenant from my pocket and handed it to the officers. Sergeant Ramirez reviewed both the altered photocopy Margaret had shown me and my original document. His eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed the modification to the text. This document appears to have been altered by hand, he observed, holding up the photocopy. Do you have the original, unaltered document? Margaret's composure started to crumble as she clutched her clipboard to her chest. It's just a clarification, she muttered. The HOA has always had inspection rights. I stepped in. Rights to inspect the exterior from common areas, yes. Not private property without permission or notice. The original language makes that clear. Sergeant Ramirez nodded and handed back the documents. This appears to be a civil matter regarding the interpretation of HOA regulations, which we can't resolve here. However, there are potential criminal issues we need to address. He turned to Margaret, his expression hardening. Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious offense, as is misuse of the 911 emergency system. The color drained from Margaret's face and Walter took a few steps back, clearly embarrassed by the situation. Sergeant Ramirez continued, At minimum, this represents an unnecessary emergency call for what is clearly a civil dispute. I'm instructing both of you to leave this property immediately. Failure to comply will result in trespassing charges. Margaret, now fully realizing the gravity of her actions, was silent. Walter, eager to avoid any more trouble, quickly nodded and began backing toward the gate. This isn't over, Margaret finally managed to whisper, her voice dripping with resentment. The board will also receive a copy of the police report, I replied calmly, including details about trespassing, filing false reports, and altering official HOA documents. I imagine they'll find it enlightening reading. Under the watchful eyes of the officers, Margaret and Walter exited my property. Sergeant Ramirez stayed behind briefly to collect my statement for his report. His demeanor remained professional, but there was a faint hint of sympathy in his eyes as he prepared to leave. We get HOA disputes more often than you'd think, he said, but emergency calls over inspection rights, that's a new one. You might want to consider running for the board yourself next election. Seems like some fresh perspective might be needed. I thanked him for the suggestion and for the department's handling of the situation. As the police cruisers pulled away, I noticed several neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the unusual sight of law enforcement in our quiet community. Margaret stood on the sidewalk across the street, her face a mask of humiliation and rage as she watched her authority and reputation crumble before her eyes. 3 days later, I received an official letter from the HOA board, minus Margaret's signature, informing me that Margaret Thornton had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into her improper enforcement practices and potential misrepresentation of the association's authority. The letter included a formal apology for the unfortunate incident at my property and a request for my attendance at a special board meeting to discuss improving transparency in membership relations. As I folded the letter and set it aside, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. All Margaret had wanted was to get inside my house. Instead, she had opened the door to the end of her reign as the neighborhood's most notorious HOA president. Lesson from the story. This experience taught me several important lessons. First and foremost, standing up for your rights is crucial, especially when it comes to matters of privacy and personal space. The law, as well as HOA rules, must be followed, but so must boundaries. Second, always be prepared. Whether it's understanding legal documents or consulting with a professional, knowledge is your best defense. Third, power should never be used to intimidate or manipulate others. Margaret's abuse of her position to impose unreasonable demands ultimately led to her downfall. Finally, sometimes, the best way to deal with petty tyranny is simply to remain calm, be patient, and let the truth reveal itself. Justice may take time, but it will always prevail when you stand firm.